Hey guys, before we get started today, I just wanted to take a quick second to point something out. Beneath this channel, you'll find my channel name, and beneath that, you'll find a number. That number is the number of subscribers. And if you pay careful attention, you'll find that that number is directly proportional to my self-esteem. And if it doesn't go up very often, I don't really have any. And so for no other reason than to help me sleep at night, if you guys would go ahead and subscribe, you don't even have to come back and check on the video or the channel, really. It's mostly just for me. But yeah, if you guys could go ahead and do that, I'd be forever grateful. Thanks. World War II marked a pivotal moment in military history as air power became central to strategy and victory. It evolved from the reconnaissance and limited strikes of World War I into a dominant force capable of shaping the course of battle. Across the skies of Europe, thousands of aircraft flew missions designed to cripple German industry, break civilian morale, and hasten the end of the war. In 1944, the United States launched the Strategic Bombing Survey to assess the impact of this new form of warfare. Conducted amid the ruins of German cities, the study aimed to answer a lingering question. Was the immense cost of the air war, measured in destroyed cities and lost lives, justified by its outcome? The statistics alone are staggering. Over 158,000 Allied airmen lost their lives. Entire cities lay in ruins, displacing millions and killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. Yet the air war was not mere destruction for its own sake. It was a calculated strategy designed to undermine Germany's ability to fight. This report invites us to reflect on whether that calculation was sound. Did the bombing campaign succeed in its objectives, or did it expose the limitations of air power as a decisive tool of war? First, let's discuss where the air campaign was considered successful. One of the most profound accomplishments made by the air campaign was the destruction of Germany's synthetic oil production facilities. By mid-1944, relentless bombing raids had severely disrupted fuel supplies, grounding much of the Luftwaffe and stalling German mechanized divisions. According to the Strategic Bombing Survey, these strikes reduced Germany's monthly fuel output to a fraction of pre-war levels, devastating the Wehrmacht's ability to sustain operations on multiple fronts. For example, in the aftermath of the attacks on oil plants like those in Leuna and Ploesti, entire tank divisions were immobilized. The survey also documented that by late 1944, remaining refineries were operating at less than 20% capacity. Another key success was the crippling of Germany's transportation network. According to the survey itself, quote, "The attack on transportation was the decisive blow that completely disorganized the German economy. It reduced war production in all categories and made it difficult to move what was produced to the front. The attack also limited the tactical mobility of the German army. Germany entered the war with an excellent railway system. It had generally overcapacity in both lines and yards. The railway system was supplemented by a strong inland waterways system connecting the important rivers of northern Germany, crisscrossing the Ruhr and connecting it with the Berlin. The waterways carried from 21 to 26% of the total freight volume. By September 1944, the air attacks on the marshalling yards, bridges, lines, and train movements produced a serious disruption in traffic all over Western Germany. Freight car loadings, which were approximately 900,000 cars for the Reich as a whole in the week of the end of August 19th, fell to 700,000 cars in the last week of October. There was some recovery in early November, but thereafter they declined erratically to 550,000 cars in the week ending of December 23rd and to 214,000 cars during the week ending March 3rd. Thereafter, the disorganization was so great that no useful statistics were kept. The attack on the waterways paralleled that on the railways. By October 14th, traffic on the Rhine had been interdicted by a bomb that detonated a German demolition charge on a bridge at Cologne. Traffic in the Ruhr dropped sharply and all water movement of coal to southern Germany ceased." Unquote. While area bombing was also a controversial strategy, it did have a notable effect on helping end the war. These large-scale raids disorganized German industry centers and diverted resources from the front. However, most notably, the raids also forced the Luftwaffe to engage heavily, which allowed waves of Allied escort fighters to pick off defending aircraft, further weakening Germany's air defenses. One notable example was the bombing of Leipzig in February of 1945, which not only devastated key industrial areas but also led to significant Luftwaffe losses as German fighter squadrons were overwhelmed. In this raid, about 95 German fighters were destroyed as they attempted to defend the city, while the U.S. lost over 20 bombers and their crews in the engagement. The fervor with which Luftwaffe pilots fought to defend their cities often forced them into overextension, which further helped Allied pilots in picking them off. Considering all of these elements, the cumulative impact of the air campaign eventually, and perhaps unsurprisingly, ground Germany's war machine down. The Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that by 1945, Germany's ability to sustain war efforts was collapsing due to the combined effects of the transportation failures, fuel shortages, and industrial disruptions. So, I think it goes without saying that without a doubt, the air war had a profound effect on the war's overall outcome. That said, in order to evaluate whether it was worthwhile, we must also take a somber look at the human cost. In the most simple terms, those successes would cost about 158,000 airmen, not counting the thousands more civilian casualties. As you break it down, that figure meant that only about 1 in 3 bomber crew members could expect to return from the war. Even more, with entire bomber squadrons lost to some of the war's most harrowing missions, it's no wonder that the Allies were eventually forced to reconsider their reliance on unescorted missions, which were a particularly pernicious reason for the high casualty rates early in the campaign. Before the outset of the war, early proponents of air power believed that bomber formations would not require fighter escorts because they assumed the bomber's heavy defensive armament, such as multiple 50 caliber machine guns positioned across the aircraft, would provide mutual defensive firepower strong enough to fend off enemy fighters. They theorized that massed formations of bombers could create an impenetrable box of overlapping fire, making fighter escorts unnecessary. Compounding this belief was the technical limitations on fighters available toward the beginning of the conflict. Because fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning lacked the range to accompany bombers, there also wasn't really an option other than to delay the air campaign until a fighter with such a range became available. Unsurprisingly, reality soon shattered these assumptions. The Luftwaffe's skilled fighter squadrons inflicted devastating losses, exposing the vulnerability of unescorted bombers. The turning point came with the deployment of the P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. Bomber losses decreased significantly as the P-51s engaged Luftwaffe fighters, securing air dominance. However, this breakthrough only came after the loss of thousands of airmen in the campaign's early stages. Another contributing factor to the harrowing survival statistics was Germany's network of anti-aircraft artillery, known as flak. This formidable defense created a lethal barrier of shrapnel that tore through bomber formations. Flak batteries protected key industrial areas and transportation hubs, making each approach a deadly gauntlet that resulted in about 40% of the bomber losses throughout the war. To put those losses in perspective, during the height of the air war, bomber crews had only about a 30% chance of surviving the required 25 missions. This meant that for many, survival was not expected. By 1943, some squadrons faced over 60% casualty rates during key operations. These figures make being a crew member aboard a strategic bomber the second most lethal position to hold throughout World War II, only trailing submariners. As poet Randall Jarrell wrote in The Death of the Ball Turret Gunner, quote, "When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose," unquote. But the carnage gets worse from there. We must also consider the civilian cost. Area bombing, which came as a response to Germany's uncanny ability to bounce back from losses of key military production targets, were the worst offenders in terms of humanitarian tragedies throughout the war. To put it in perspective, the firebombing of Hamburg during Operation Gomorrah in 1943 created a firestorm that killed over 60 to 100,000 civilians and displaced hundreds of thousands more. Entire neighborhoods were incinerated with temperatures so intense that they created deadly fire tornadoes. Similarly, the 1945 attack on Dresden reduced the city to rubble. First-hand accounts from survivors described infernos that obliterated entire neighborhoods and burned thousands alive. As Kurt Vonnegut wrote in Slaughterhouse-Five, quote, "Everything was gone but the stones," unquote. The point of these crimes against humanity, as we've mentioned, was to destroy morale and disrupt industry. However, even more tragically, in many cases, the bombing was for nothing, because while morale was affected, the Nazis forced the war machine to march on through coercion and control. Quote, "The morale of the German people deteriorated under aerial attack. The night raids were feared far more than daylight raids. The people lost faith in the prospect of victory, in their leaders, and in the promises and propaganda to which they were subjected. Most of all, they wanted the war to end. Yet, under ruthless Nazi control, they showed surprising resistance to the terror and hardship of repeated air attack, to the destruction of their homes and belongings, and to the conditions under which they were reduced to live. Their morale, their belief in ultimate victory or satisfactory compromise, and their confidence in their leaders declined, but they continued to work efficiently as long as the physical means of production remained," unquote. Even more, while the will of the people can be thought to have been artificially propped up by Nazi control, so too was the industry, to an extent, as the survey points out. Quote, while there was constant pressure throughout for German manpower for the Wehrmacht, the industrial labor supply, as augmented by foreign labor, was sufficient to permit the diversion of large numbers to the repair of bomb damage or the clearance of debris with relatively small sacrifice of essential production. Great reserves of foreign labor only awaited voluntary or forced recruitment. The industrial plants of France, the Low Countries, Poland, and Czechoslovakia had been added to that of Germany. After the defeat at Moscow early in 1942, armament production increased rapidly. However, such increases were more the result of improvements in industrial efficiency than of general economic mobilization. Studies of German manpower utilization show that throughout the war, a great deal of German industry was on a single-shift basis. Relatively few German women, less than in the First World War, were drawn into industry, and the average work week was below British standards." Unquote. So, as we lay it all out, the act of bombing itself was more dangerous than everything, save for sealing yourself in a coffin and sinking to the bottom of the ocean. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed, justified only by destroying their country's morale and productivity, and the morale and productivity in question was relatively unaffected due to Nazi propaganda and forced labor. Even more, German workers, despite the raids, were still working less hours than their British counterparts. With all of this in mind, I see how it may be easy for some to lose sight of the overall victories of the campaign. However, with that said, it cannot be denied that victory was achieved nonetheless. And as far as the lasting legacy of this campaign, I think the survey itself addressed that nicely. Quote, the city area raids have left their mark on the German people as well as on their cities, far more than any other military action that preceded the actual occupation of Germany itself. These attacks left the German people with a solid lesson in the disadvantages of war. It was a terrible lesson, and conceivably that lesson, both in Germany and abroad, could be the most lasting single effect of the air war. Unquote. The survey goes on to suggest, quote, the great lesson to be learned in the battered towns of England and the ruined cities of Germany is that the best way to win a war is to prevent it from occurring. That must be the ultimate end to which our best efforts are devoted. It has been suggested, and wisely so, that this objective is well served by ensuring the strength and security of the United States. Strength based on these principles is no threat to world peace. Unquote. Ultimately, it's my viewpoint that in any war that escalates to the scale of World War II, human tragedy is inevitable and casualties will always be immense. To question the air war is to suppose that alternative means could have been used to end the war, such as a more protracted, costly ground war or a more expedited and clever use of nuclear weapons. However, neither of these alternatives make it apparent that the death toll would have been reduced. In fact, in some scenarios, they could have easily been made worse, especially considering Germany was making progress toward developing their own nuclear weapons. As such, while it's sobering to reflect on the immense cost of the strategic bombing campaign, it stands in my mind as an overall victory in terms of both ending the war and limiting human suffering when compared with other potential historical outcomes.